Thank you very much. The title of this talk is A Relational Egalitarian Defense of Guest Worker Programs. So I'll be defending guest worker programs, at least in a qualified way. By guest worker programs, what I mean is programs that allow non-citizens to enter a country for work purposes without granting them full citizenship and full rights that go along with being a full citizen, including, for example, rights to benefit from subsidies and transfer programs. Now, Michael Walzer and Christopher E. Wellman are two prominent philosophers who argue that guest worker programs are highly problematic from the standpoint of relational egalitarianism. And they argue that most forms of guest worker programs should, on those grounds, be opposed. I think that Walzer and Wellman are mistaken, and that there are actually strong relational egalitarian reasons to support many forms of guest worker programs. And I'll be trying to make that case in this paper. So first, a few words on relational egalitarianism. Usually, explanations of relational egalitarianism that I've come across at least start by explaining what it's not. And I'll take that approach here. Prominent 20th century political philosophers like Richard Arneson, G. A. Cohen, Ronald Dworkin, and Thomas Nagel defend different versions of luck egalitarianism. It's a simple fact about the human condition that different individuals have different life prospects, partially because of luck. That seems unfair, and luck egalitarians think that justice is primarily about minimizing unfairness. Well, minimizing unfairness seems like a plausible goal for somebody concerned with equality. Elizabeth Anderson, a prominent relational egalitarian, argues that luck egalitarians have lost sight of what the point of equality really is. According to Anderson, the primary focus of egalitarianism should be the relationships within which goods are distributed, not only the distribution themselves. More specifically, and this is a quote, negatively, egalitarians seek to abolish oppression, that is, forms of social relationship by which some people dominate, exploit, marginalize, demean, and inflict violence upon others. And positively, egalitarians seek a social order in which persons stand in relations of equality. Understood in this way, relational egalitarianism has important implications for how inequality matters in the context of international justice. Relational egalitarians argue that inequality between people who live in the same country is more concerning than inequality between people who live in different countries. To somebody with cosmopolitan sympathies, this may seem implausible. If all people have equal moral standing, then shouldn't global rather than national inequality be what's most relevant to world justice? Relational egalitarians have a response to this cosmopolitan line of criticism. And that response is that there are morally relevant differences between inequalities that exist between citizens of the same country and inequalities that exist between people who are not citizens of the same country. Inequality between co-nationals is especially concerning because people who are citizens of the same country are related to each other in a way that people who are citizens of different countries are not. To illustrate this point, Christopher E. Wellman, writing with Andrew Walton, asks us to consider two instances of inequality. So in the first instance, there's a society A, in which everybody is equally affluent, and a society B, in which everyone is equally poor. So that's the first case. Then, important facts about this case, though. Societies A and B are on opposite sides of the world and have never had any contact with each other. So in the second case, we can imagine only one society, society C, in which case there's a group of citizens as affluent as those in society A from the first case, and another group of citizens as poor as those in society B from the first case, and they're all living in the same society together. We should worry more about the instance of inequality involving society C than the one involving societies A and B, Altman and Wellman argue. Because the fact that inequality in society C exists within a single political community creates the possibility of marginalization, oppression, exploitation, and other problematic forms of social relation that could not exist between citizens of A and citizens of B. So now I'll briefly explain Walzer and Wellman's reasons for opposing guest worker programs on relational egalitarian grounds. In his discussion of guest worker programs, Michael Walzer considers Western European countries that during the time he was writing Spheres of Justice habitually brought in low-skilled laborers from lower-income countries. Affluent Western European countries with strong labor unions had a hard time attracting domestic workers to low-paying, physically difficult, and dangerous jobs. But for the overall functioning of these countries, it was necessary to find people who were willing to do these jobs. An obvious solution was to establish guest worker programs that imported workers willing to take jobs that native workers were not willing to take. The guest workers that Walzer discusses lived under harsh conditions relative to the citizens of the countries in which they were working. They worked long hours, they weren't given access to social services, and their residency was conditional on having employment. The programs in question were consciously designed so that the workers did not have opportunities to integrate themselves into local culture and society or build and maintain social relationships. For example, Walzer writes that the workers were, quote, either prevented or discouraged from bringing dependents along with them, and they were housed in barracks segregated by sex on the outskirts of the cities in which they worked. As is the case with any guest worker program, the workers were not given the right to vote. Because of this lack of political voice, the guest workers Walzer discusses experienced the state as, he writes, pervasive and frightening power that shapes their lives and regulates their every move and never asks their opinion. The guest workers are typically an exploited or oppressed class as well, and they are exploited or oppressed at least in part because they are disenfranchised, incapable of organizing effectively for self-defense. So according to Walzer's analysis, keeping the workers from improving their condition was part of the whole entire point of having a guest worker program. Wealthy European countries established programs from that work to find people who would work for lower wages and worse conditions than domestic workers. If the workers had had political and social standing necessary to make things better for themselves, then their employers would eventually have had to pay them more and improve their working conditions, which is exactly what these countries are trying to avoid. Now, the guest worker programs that Walzer analyzes were obviously problematic from the perspective of relational egalitarianism. They fostered a whole range of relational inequalities. The denial of political and social standing of guest workers was for the express purpose of preventing them from improving their conditions, and European host countries were pretty clearly taking advantage of the guest workers' disadvantaged situations. So although my main purpose in this paper is to show why relational egalitarians should be more amenable to guest worker programs than Wellman and especially Walzer are, I don't wish to deny that there's room for legitimate relational egalitarian criticism of guest worker programs. On the contrary, I insist that there is. Poorly designed guest worker programs, like the ones Walzer discusses, clearly make immigrants vulnerable to being oppressed and dominated in the ways that concern relational egalitarianism. But having granted the legitimacy of Walzer's concerns with guest worker programs, or at least the ones that he considers, I will now discuss where I think that he is on relational egalitarian grounds actually mistaken. So Walzer writes, as a quote, "Men and women are either subject to the state's authority or they are not. And if they are subject, they must be given a say, and ultimately an equal say, in what the authority does. Democratic citizens then have a choice. If they want to bring in new workers, they must be prepared to enlarge their own membership. If they're unwilling to accept new members, they must find ways within the limits of the domestic labor market to get socially necessary work done. And those are their only two choices. Either let people in with full range of rights as full citizens, seems to me that it's actually false. So to reiterate, Walzer says, men and women, if they're subject to a state's authority, must be given say, and ultimately an equal say, in what that authority does. But if I visit Helsinki for a couple of days, even though I'm subject to Finland's political authority during my visit, it doesn't seem like I deserve a say, and certainly not an equal say, in what Finland does with its political authority. But putting that issue aside, the main reason for rejecting Walzer's strong claim about the impermissibility of guest worker programs is this. Just because relational egalitarians have reasons to worry about guest worker programs does not support a conclusion nearly as strong as the claim that democratic states must not allow guest workers at all. Now, Wellman actually agrees that Walzer's conclusion is too strong. According to Wellman, there's no necessary problem with guest worker programs that allow only immigrants into the host country for a duly limited period of time, although he doesn't specify exactly what he means by duly limited. At the same time, though, Wellman writes, we would want to examine carefully arrangements on a case-by-case basis to ensure that workers are not put in positions where they're objectionably vulnerable to oppression. Now, to be fair to Wellman, he reasonably acknowledges that it's possible for the beneficial consequences of a given arrangement to outweigh concerns about relational inequalities. This makes Wellman a little harder to pin down with Walzer, but I still think that Wellman's position can be criticized on basically the same grounds as Walzer's. To make a convincing relational egalitarian argument against guest worker programs, it's not enough to show that the guest worker programs are instances of worrisome inequalities. One must additionally show that inequalities associated with guest worker programs are more worrisome than inequalities associated with keeping those who would participate in a guest worker program from immigrating at all. My claim is that when we examine guest worker programs in the context of other policies that are currently in place, the relational egalitarian case for guest worker programs becomes much stronger than if they're examined in isolation. To be clear in what follows, I argue not that the beneficial consequences associated with allowing non-citizens to participate in guest worker programs outweigh or trump relational egalitarian worries about guest worker programs, but that rather there are good specifically relational egalitarian reasons for giving non-citizen workers a legal way to enter countries for work purposes. The main flaw in the relational egalitarian critiques of guest worker programs that I've been considering is that they seem to assume or sometimes simply assert that relational egalitarian concerns are necessarily more significant for relations between people who live in the same territory than they are for relations between people that cross international boundaries. Wellman and Walzer don't seem to recognize the extent to which the international status quo should raise concerns for relational egalitarians. Recall the example from Altman and Wellman I mentioned before about inter-society inequality versus intra-society inequality. Just to briefly reiterate, you've got the society A where everyone's rich, society B where everyone's poor, and no connection. And you have society C where there's the same number who are as rich as A and as poor as B. They all live in the same society. Because, the thinking goes, members of society C occupy the same political community, they occupy relationships that are affected by these inequalities, and so the inequality that exists in C is more concerning than inequality between A and B. Now, Altman and Wellman are careful to stipulate, like I said, that no one in A and B knows anything about the other society's existence. Now, there's nothing wrong with this stipulation if the goal is just to clarify what is distinctive about the relational egalitarian approach versus other kinds of egalitarianism, which is primarily what Altman and Wellman are doing in this passage. But it's clear that in the real world, even societies that are geographically separated from each other have contact with each other and are certainly aware of each other's existence and influence each other in various ways. This means that relationships between members of the same political community are not the only relationships that are affected by inequalities. Relationships between members of different political communities can be affected by inequalities as well. And by focusing just on inequalities between co-nationals and not on relations between citizens of different nations, relational egalitarian analyses of guest worker programs fail to appreciate how guest worker programs can alleviate problematic international relational inequalities. Although he doesn't himself discuss relational egalitarianism, so far as I am aware, Thomas Pogge's writing raises issues that seem to me especially relevant here. Pogge argues that wealthy countries not only fail to effectively aid the world's poor, but also actively harm them by supporting a global order that favors the rich and powerful at the expense of the poor, powerless, and vulnerable. The rich bring this system against the poor in a variety of ways: subsidies on domestic products, tariffs on goods from developing countries, bribes for officials in developing countries, purchases of natural resources from corrupt and illegitimate heads of state, and loans to illegitimate and dysfunctional leaders. This exploitation of the world's poor by the world's rich stems, according to Pogge, from an imbalance of power. Whereas rich countries have functional political systems and sufficient resources to effectively represent the interests of their citizens at the global level, poor countries often do not. Thus, when there's a conflict of interest between a poor country and a rich country, it is often the rich country's interests that prevail. It's inequality in the relationships between rich countries and poor countries, as well as between citizens of the former and citizens of the latter, that allow the world's rich to dominate and oppress the world's poor in the ways that Pogge identifies. Therefore, these international relationships are exactly the sorts of relationships that should be of utmost concerns to relational egalitarians. Because of the severe and oppressive relational inequalities that exist in the current international order, there's a strong relational egalitarian argument for reforming international institutions to give poor countries a way of effectively representing the interests of their citizens. But you may be wondering, what does that have to do with guest worker programs? Well, it's easy to say that the international order must be reformed so that the world's poor are treated more justly. But unfortunately, actually reforming the international order is pretty hard to do. There are a lot of powerful interest groups, where interest groups defined broadly enough to include countries, that benefit from the current international order and are thus highly resistant to change. Additionally, the political institutions in many developing countries are either too dysfunctional or lack the resources necessary to capably represent the interests of their own people by participating in international institutions. In light of these issues, those of us who are concerned by the level of inequality at the global level have strong reason to use any and every tool available to ameliorate the effects of these oppressive relational inequalities. The potential of guest worker programs to reduce oppressive relational inequality may not be immediately obvious, but we shouldn't underestimate. If oppressive international relational inequalities facilitate exploitation of poor countries by rich countries, then in addition to taking steps to eventually put an end to this exploitation, rich countries should in the meantime offer citizens of poor countries a way out. Insofar as guest worker programs represent a politically feasible way of doing this, they deserve serious consideration. In addition to giving people the ability to escape domination and oppression in their native countries, there's also strong evidence that allowing people to live and work in places other than their native countries can yield significant economic benefits for the immigrants themselves, especially very poor immigrants. According to economists Michael Clemens, Claudia Montenegro, and Lance Pritchett, differences in capital accumulation, infrastructure, and institutional quality between countries, combined with strong restrictions on international labor movement, give rise to an economic phenomenon that is called the place premium. Place premium refers to the fact that an individual's productivity, which according to conventional economic theory is one important determinant of an individual's earnings, productivity varies significantly depending on the country the individual works in. So Clemens, Montenegro, and Pritchett estimate that A typical Bolivian-born, Bolivian-educated, prime-age, urban male, formal sector wage worker with moderate schooling makes a wage higher by a factor of 2.7 solely by working in the United States instead of Bolivia. That is to say, if we take two identical workers, and we put one in Bolivia, and we put the other in the United States, the one in the United States has the potential to earn something like 2.7 times as much as the one in Bolivia. For some countries, this wage gap between a worker in the worker's country of origin and an otherwise identical worker in the U.S. is as high as a factor of 8.4. Simply by crossing a border, or maybe several borders, citizens of poor countries can more and sometimes significantly more than double their earning potential. This represents a fairly staggering gain in economic welfare for potential poor country to rich country migrants. All of this goes to show that a policy that would allow citizens of poor countries to legally work in rich countries is likely to have significant economic benefits, both for migrant workers and for migrant workers' families back home as well, the latter being in the form of remittances. By giving some people who are among the world's worst off the opportunity to become somewhat better off, guest worker programs have the potential to reduce the severity of some of the worst relational inequalities. Thus, relational egalitarians should support immigration policies that allow people, and especially people who are poor by global standards, to cross international boundaries in order to live and work. And since guest worker programs are plausibly a politically feasible way of increasing freedom to migrate compared to other policy reform proposals aimed at increasing poor people's ability to migrate, relational egalitarians should give them serious consideration. Now, before concluding, I want to suggest another instance of relational inequality that I think guest worker programs could help to alleviate. So, I have a case study for this. This is a true story from the newspaper. Consider the experience of a woman named Elena. Elena immigrated to the United States to find work at restaurants in the domestic service industry. The restaurant job she found required her to do long hours of hard work for very low pay relative to American standards. She worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for an hourly wage of $4.16. Hard work for relatively low pay is, of course, more or less the norm for life as a low-skilled immigrant in the United States. But things are even worse than that for Elena. She was denied pay for 6 months by her employer. She was also required to do more and more tasks that were not included in her job description. This seems like exactly the kind of situation that causes relational egalitarians to worry about guest worker programs. Poor immigrants enter a country without the rights and resources that citizens enjoy and are thus taken advantage of by unscrupulous employers who try to exploit immigrants' disadvantaged and often desperate situations. But there's an important detail about Elena's situation that causes her to be especially vulnerable. Elena is not a guest worker, but an illegal immigrant. Elena is far from alone. The Pew Hispanic Research Center estimated that there were 11.2 million undocumented immigrants living in the United States as of March of 2010. And the U.S. is not alone in that, of course. As of 2008, according to one estimate that I found, the European Union had more than 10 million undocumented immigrants living within its borders. Now, Elena shares not only her legal status with millions of other people around the world, but also a range of experiences that are typical of life as an undocumented immigrant. Many immigrants, despite desperate to find a way to support their families because of a lack of decent work opportunities in their native countries, set off to the United States and other rich countries without even knowing what kind of work they will be doing, what they will be paid, or what the terms of employment will be. To get across the border, prospective illegal immigrants often must pay thousands of dollars to a coyote or smuggler. They're packed into the backs of dark, hot, crowded vans and trucks where they must stay for days at a time without food or even in any sanitary way of relieving themselves. And then once they succeed in crossing the border, low-skilled illegal immigrants face many of the same barriers as low-skilled guest workers. Since they often don't speak the language of the country that's their new home, they face barriers in performing even the most mundane daily activities. They live in small communities with fellow illegal immigrants that tend to be isolated from the rest of society. They're usually unfamiliar with laws and procedures in their new homes, which leaves them at the mercy of their employers. As in the case of Atlanta, employers frequently take advantage of this situation by underpaying their undocumented employees, by subjecting undocumented employees to dangerous workplace conditions, and by violating the terms of their employment agreements. So the purpose of this discussion is to highlight the inevitable problems that will exist for a country that elects to pursue a closed border policy, or almost inevitable problems. Philosophers often explicitly make unrealistic, simplifying assumptions so that they're able to reflect on questions about morality and justice without getting bogged down in a mess of empirical debates. Philosophers identify some desirable ideal and then think of it as the job of social scientists to figure out how to reach that ideal and to figure out how to deal with complicating factors that may emerge as the idealizing assumptions are relaxed. Now, I certainly have nothing against an academic division of labor, and I acknowledge that philosophers are often not well qualified to address complicated economic, sociological, and psychological questions. Obviously, however, the value of philosophical idealization and specifying goals for societies and states to pursue depends on whether or not philosophers' idealizing assumptions are justified. One assumption that philosophers often make is that when the state decides upon a system of laws, the people governed by those laws will obey them. But it's not clear that this is always a reasonable assumption to make, and in particular, problems arise when Walzer and Wellman seem to assume, or at least not address, problems arising from a lack of universal compliance with restrictive immigration laws. Real quickly, here's the visual of my presentation. I have a political cartoon here that I wanted to make a little bigger. So there's a sign that says 20-foot border fence. This was back during the debate in the United States about a fence along the southern border. And then there's a sign there that's, I guess, supposed to be in Mexico that says Raul's 21-foot ladder rentals. When people have strong incentives, economic or otherwise, to do something, they tend to be exceptionally innovative at finding ways around legal restrictions on doing that thing. Let me conclude real quickly here. So, Walzer and Wellman worry about the relational inequalities that may exist between citizens and guest worker immigrants. Whether relational egalitarian worries about guest worker programs justify opposing the programs depends on what the alternatives to those programs would be. It would be one thing if the alternative to guest worker programs were an open borders policy. But practically speaking, the alternative to guest worker programs is often restricted immigration policies plus a lot of illegal immigration. I tried to show that when the alternative is that, then relational egalitarian concerns about guest worker programs are often outweighed, I think, by concerns about people who are forced to stay in their native countries